In the 21st century, our leaders have warned us that the greatest threat to humanity in our time will be marked by violent differences between cultures. 100 years ago, a poet-philosopher from British India, Muhammad Iqbal, spoke of a more hopeful vision for the future.
And Iqbal was the last great flowering of this rich tradition of wisdom poetry in Urdu and in Persian in the Indian environment.
Educated in the finest institutions of Europe, yet subjected to colonial rule in India, Iqbal was an inspiration to the people of the subcontinent. Living between worlds, he believed mutual respect for the cultural other was the only way for unity to be achieved.
To have somebody like this on our screen as a possibility 100 years ago is extremely important because it refutes the facile notion of a clash of civilization. It demonstrates both to Americans and Europeans on the one hand and to people in Asian Muslim countries on the other hand that this is not only a possibility, but it's been a part of our world for well over 100 years.
Differences perceived as threatening by some were celebrated in Iqbal's poetry. He believed diversity was the underlying force that sustained our ever-changing world. As an Islamic reformer, Iqbal encouraged Muslims to see the wisdom of the Quran as synonymous with advancements in modern science.
So the first really important contribution of Iqbal is to speak to folks broadly in the 21st century in the West and to say to them, come back again, re-look at science, which you believe is central to modern life, re-look at scripture, particularly the Quran, which you may look at as something outside of the modern world, and I'll show you how these two have always been an intimate relationship.
Iqbal understood that it was only through our relationships with others that we could begin to see ourselves. He would call the rampant military paranoia of our times a crisis of understanding. We are not making the world safer through imperial or corporate conquest in the name of freedom. In reality, we have waged a war against our own being.
But it's not a conflict or a clash of civilizations. It is a clash within ourselves too.
Iqbal's own life was one full of contradiction. Concerned with the future of India as a whole, he would eventually become credited with the idea of a consolidated Muslim state. Though revered as the national poet and spiritual father of Pakistan, he believed in a broader humanity that transcended the borders of national lines. Who was Muhammad Iqbal? And what was the message he wished would reach people long after his death?
He sees himself as an agent of change, and that change and the journey starts from within.
Many a poet was born after his death, opened our eyes when his own were closed, and journeyed forth again from nothingness, like roses blossoming over the earth of his grave.
Home to nearly 200 million people, it is the second largest Muslim country in the world. Today, Pakistan is considered a political powder keg by some, finding itself on the front lines of the war on terror. However, before 1947, Pakistan made up the northwest corner of British India. During the mid-1800s, the British East India Company began to monopolize trade and commerce in South Asia. By 1857, desperate Indian soldiers sparked an uprising against the occupation. This event was perceived as the first battle for India's independence. Yet the revolt failed, and in 1858 the dissolution of the East India Company transferred control of India to British Parliament. It was amidst this oppressive atmosphere that Iqbal's family descended to the Punjab from the mountains of Kashmir. Originally Hindu Brahmins, they converted to Islam and settled in a town called Sialkot. In 1877, Muhammad Iqbal was born. Iqbal's father, Sheikh Nur Muhammad, was a respected tailor with a genuine love for Islam. Well known amongst the mystics and scholars of Sialkot, Nur Muhammad encouraged his son to read the Quran as though it were being revealed to him directly. While most of the youth attended classes geared towards Islamic studies, it became apparent to Iqbal's mentor, Mir Hassan, that the intelligent young man would have a much brighter future in the academic world.
His teacher, of course, managed to persuade his father that he should not be sent to a maktab or to a madrasa. Rather, he should be sent to a modern school.
Mir Hassan opened the mind of his young student with Urdu poetry. It would become his main vehicle for expression throughout his life. In one of Iqbal's earliest poems, Himalaya, he describes his first religious experience. Standing at the base of the immense mountain range, he was overcome by a profound sense of the divine.
You are the song whose opening verse is the sky. You lead man to the solitude of his heart. Though you stand on earth, you make the heavens your home.
The religious experience of Iqbal, I think, is a sense of the vastness of the cosmos, the vastness of the mountains, the power and the strength of that which is not human. And yet, this also awakens within humans the sense that the power within is as vast as the power without.
At the age of 18, Iqbal left for Lahore. It was a vibrant city, full of admiration for the arts. Preoccupied with poetry, he flunked his law examinations. In the midst of an unhappy arranged marriage, Iqbal came into contact with another teacher who would change his life. Thomas Arnold was a British scholar with a deep respect for Islam. The two men forged a great friendship, and when Arnold left India to return to England, he encouraged Iqbal to pursue a higher education abroad.
But what Arnold did is to basically say, you know, you're one of the brightest guys I've taught. Instead of simply being a lawyer, which of course he was trained to be, so, you know, think about this larger possibility that you could be a scholar.
When Iqbal was 28, he left Lahore for England in 1905.
He needed to see a physical embodiment of, let's say, Western ideals in the best sense of the word. You know, not just hanging up out there some concepts written in books. He needed to see a living example.
During this period, he achieved his bar in law at Lincoln's Inn and his master's degree in Cambridge. Immersed in education, he withdrew himself from social life. He experienced Europe in its best and worst conditions, but was alarmed by what he perceived as unstable nationalism and unforgiving justification for colonial domination. His once frequent writing came to a near halt. He later described his experience as a critical moment in his life. One of the few poems he wrote during this period dramatically criticized the materialistic worldview he had witnessed in the West firsthand.
O people of the West, the city of God is not a marketplace. What you've been holding as currency will turn out to be counterfeit. Your civilization will commit suicide with its own dagger, because a nest built on a frail bough cannot be durable.
Living in England had showed Iqbal the reality of colonialism on a much broader scale. Although just as gifted as his peers, Iqbal felt treated as a second-class citizen, a sensation he was happy to be rid of in 1907 when he continued his education in Germany. It would be the only time in his life when he was not a subject to the British throne. When Iqbal returned to India in 1908, he was a changed man. Following his return from Europe, Iqbal began taking note of his experiences in a small book that wouldn't be published until after his death. From these stray reflections sprouted the seeds of most of his great works. Being totally immersed in the culture that dominated his homeland had allowed Iqbal to see himself clearly, and the experience had left him determined to help inspire the Muslims of India.
And he comes back to India and he begins to reconnect with his own people. And what takes his breath away is what he finds the state of denial. And he finds that his own fellow men and women, as if they have locked themselves out of that festivity, of that festival of change. And this is an amazing struggle to dawn upon his own people that there is this banquet of change happening. Be a part of it, or you'd be too late.
Upon his return, Iqbal began teaching at Government College. Unsatisfied and preferring not to work for the British government, he began to practice law, earning just enough to sustain his family. Europe had left Iqbal in between worlds. He believed the people of India could benefit from the modern education, but it needed to be applied in a way that was compatible with the real essence of their tradition.
The East, and particularly the Muslim East, has opened its eyes after slumbering for centuries. The Eastern people have, however, realized that life cannot affect a revolution in its environment before it has had, in the first instance, a revolution in the inner depths of its own being. Nor can a new world assume external form before its existence takes on a shape in the hearts of men.
Iqbal was encouraging the people of South Asia to carry their traditions forward and align them with the future.
Tradition is about what is worth transmitting, what is worth carrying in the movement of life. So tradition has to be something alive, something living. The time we have, the time of action is the present. And tradition itself is engaged in the action today, in the present, to shape the future. That means that in the present, human action, the action of the individual, is not only shaping the future, but also giving meaning to tradition and inventing it at that time.
In 1911, just as European powers began to occupy the majority of the Muslim world, Iqbal's writing became less romantic and more political. His words spoke directly to the community, encouraging the active transformation of individuals.
He's stimulating them by his poetry to say, wake up, you know, the world is beautiful, God is good. There's no reason for you to be depressed and miserable like that.
He taunts the contemporary Muslims and he compares them to their great ancestors. He says, you guys, you the contemporaries, suicide is your way of life. Your forebears, they were people of dignity and self-confidence. He says, you guys, you run away from the bonds of brotherhood. Your forebears, they are people who embraced and they were prepared to sacrifice themselves in generosity to others. He said, you guys are only all about talk. They were all about character. You guys chase after the rosebud. They dreamt of great gardens full of all kinds of flowers.
Iqbal was trying to remind Muslims of their great heritage. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, the golden age of Islam occurred. Sweeping advances in science, philosophy, medicine, and education took place, and a unique understanding and exchange of ideas developed between cultures. The single most influential figure on Iqbal's thought would emerge at the height of this period. The great mystic poet Rumi was forced to leave Afghanistan in the early 1200s due to the invasion of the Mongol hordes. He fled to Anatolia, modern-day Konya, Turkey. Like the Sufis who followed him, he spent his life trying to understand humanity's relationship to the divine. Though the two men were separated by over 600 years, Iqbal considered Rumi his spiritual guide. He would regularly turn to the mystical poetry of Rumi for inspiration. After Rumi's death, his son founded the order of the Mavlavi, or the Whirling Dervishes. The dervishes were a Sufi order that followed Rumi's basic techniques through a meditative dance. Dervish is a Persian term derived from the word door, referring to one who is at the threshold between awareness of the world and awareness of the divine.
Rumi's whirling dervishes, what do they symbolize? Why do they go anti-clockwise? Because all the planets go that way. Why should they whirl? Whirl, they're representing the whole universe. And why the master remains stationary? He represents God. So apparently they in fact depict the movement of the entire universe when they dance, with one hand upwards and one hand downwards, showing, symbolizing the communication between the heaven and earth.
Sufism is questioning and continuous questioning of anything institutionalized to reveal the life which is behind it. That being said, there is an understanding of Sufism, of mysticism, as some form of escapism. The Sufism that of extinction, looking for extinction, or being absorbed and lost in contemplation, is obviously runs totally contrary to what Iqbal's thinking is.
During his time in Germany, Iqbal had achieved his PhD in Persian metaphysics. Much of the vast history of Eastern mysticism followed the belief that all of nature was a part of God. Iqbal believed this created a dangerous rift between personal responsibility and vague spiritual principles.
The world is not something to be seen or known through concepts, but something to be made and remade through continuous action.
Because he was looking for what was the problem that had allowed European powers to overwhelm the Muslim states of Asia. And like many people, he began to look for some kind of ideological error or some metaphysical mistake that had taken people astray. And so Sufism became a candidate for the villain.
The early 1900s saw the vast majority of the Muslim world in disrepair. Colonialism had successfully covered half the globe. By 1922, the British alone held control over 25% of the world's population. As a result, many of the people living under this domination were terrified that their own cultures were being destroyed.
He certainly is feeling that there's a lament that Muslims could have for their loss of, if you will, worldly or political power in the grand scheme of things, because they've been reduced to being a colony, a subset of a place called the Empire, which is Britain.
Struggling to find peace in turbulent times, Iqbal remarried twice after his return from Europe. His first marriage had come to an end, and though he supported his wife financially until his death, his eldest son, Aftab, would never forgive his father. In November of 1914, both Iqbal's mother and his daughter, Miraj, passed away. Amidst tragedy at home and the mounting tensions of World War I, Iqbal began writing a book in Persian titled The Secrets of the Self. Influenced greatly by Rumi, it was a call to action and an illustration of the power we have as individuals.
He was very aware of the novelty of his thought, the irreverence of his questioning, and the task ahead of him. But he was going on and on about the question of how do you awaken the mind?
The form of existence is an effect of the self. Everything you see is a secret of the self. When the self awoke to consciousness, it revealed a universe of thought. 100 words are hidden in its essence. Self-affirmation brings not self to light. By the self, the seed of opposition is sown in the world. It imagines itself to be other than itself, and it makes from itself the forms of others.
Life, to Iqbal, could only be described in terms of experience, and experience is a function of the ego or the self. The personality of a self must be defined in terms of its own action. So the movements of the universe, from atoms to galaxies, are various expressions of this same organization. Iqbal believed consciousness was not just a property of humankind, but a vital process of cosmic development.
I think the distinction of spirit and body has done a lot of harm. Man is essentially a force, or rather a combination of forces.
Just as self-realization must be actualized by individuals, so too must communities discover their own identity.
The self has layers, and we only sort of, as it were, scratch the surface or get each inch down in our lifetime, and we don't know the depths of the possibilities of our own being.
The situation in the subcontinent was changing rapidly, and by the time the First World War had ended in 1918, well over 1 million Indians had served the British with the hopes of achieving self-government. When this did not happen, the vast disappointment ushered in a new era of unrest in the communities of India. By this time, Iqbal had become a well-respected poet, not just in the Punjab, but throughout South Asia and parts of Europe. In Lahore, people would visit Iqbal's home regularly. Everyone from students to politicians sought advice, and all were welcome. He would rarely leave his house. His days were divided between reading, writing, and discussions that could run late into the night, covering topics ranging from the nature of existence to the communal problems of India. Becoming ever more respected as a man of the people, his work continued to express his main convictions about the changing political landscape. Iqbal continually tried to appeal to the West through his writing, but his message was not being received. The people of India, however, were listening.
The inner turmoil of the nations is precursor to some great spiritual and cultural change. The Great War of Europe was an apocalypse. It has annihilated the old world order in nearly every dimension. Nature is now creating a new Adam and a new world to suit him in the depths of life, from the ashes of culture and civilization, and we can see a vague glimpse of this in the writings of Einstein.
Before the term quantum mechanics had been coined, Iqbal understood Einstein's theory of relativity as an opportunity for religion and science to find common ground. This new world Einstein was describing mirrored the one Iqbal had been waiting for. It was an opportunity to take a deeper look at what had gone unquestioned for centuries. In his writing, he says,
"Classical physics has learned to criticize its own foundations. As a result of this criticism, the kind of materialism which it originally necessitated is rapidly disappearing."
Iqbal shared Einstein's assertion that the highest achievements of science came from a cosmic religious feeling of the universe. This humble appreciation of the mystery of one's own being was a feeling Iqbal believed the modern world had begun to lose. The only way to preserve this mystery in one's own life was through love, more than a mere emotion, but as a mystical force, as Rumi had also described. Love, as an active awareness, gives vision to our world and infuses human action with a higher purpose.
Beyond the stars, there are other worlds. Beyond the heavens, there are still more worlds. The test of love goes beyond all of these worlds. You only exist insofar as you love. If you do not love, you do not exist.
With the aftermath of the First World War, the independence movement in India, led by Gandhi and Nehru, was on the rise. Iqbal's own involvement with the Muslim League and the Hindu Congress also became more intensified.
And you had fights to throw the British out of India, and that was a very exuberant time when they were very cheerful and they thought things would go well, but it failed. It collapsed. The movement led by Gandhi failed.
Gandhi had encountered Iqbal on a few occasions. Iqbal's initial approval of Gandhi's own independence movement faded as Muslims felt Gandhi made little effort to address their concerns. Iqbal also disagreed with Gandhi's approach towards the minorities of India. However, a respectful friendship existed between the two. In an exchange of letters, Gandhi asked Iqbal if he would take a position teaching in a new school in India. In his response to Gandhi, Iqbal wrote,
"Situated as we are, political independence must be preceded by economic independence. And in this respect, the Muslims of India are far behind other communities of this country. Hoping you are well."
In 1924, Iqbal's wife, Sardar, gave birth to their son, Javed.
At a later period in my life, Pakistan movement had started, and Jinnah used to come and visit us. I still remember the day when it was probably 6th of June, when I was specially asked by my father in the morning that I should join him at 4 o'clock in his room and bring my autograph book. He said, "There's a person coming here. He's coming at 4 o'clock and you'll be present in the room." So I went in the room with my autograph book, and I noticed Jinnah sitting next to him. So I advanced my autograph book towards Jinnah, and he wrote his signature, made his signatures on it with the date. And then he looked up towards me and he said, "Do you also write poetry?" So I said, "No, sir." The next question came, "Then what are you going to do when you grow up?" You know, he spoke English like an Englishman. So I had no answer, so I just kept silence. So he turned towards my father and said to him, "He doesn't answer." So my father answered me. He said, "He won't answer. He's waiting for you to tell him what he is to do."
Jinnah would eventually become the first president of Pakistan. But before this, he would turn to Iqbal regularly for advice and spiritual guidance. Though not a religious man himself, Jinnah became convinced Iqbal's concerns for the Muslims of India were justified. The two men forged a friendship that became crucial for the future of India. Negotiations between the Muslim League and the Hindu Congress began to deteriorate in light of irreconcilable differences. With no agreement on how the new political system would be formed, the possibility of a two-state solution became likely.
The view of the majority party was simply that India is a monolithic whole and we are the sole representatives and we will deal with the British and we'll settle among ourselves later on about the power sharing formula. The minority said, no, India is a pluralistic society and you are not the sole representatives. We have to negotiate with the British government for a settlement of this power sharing formula. This could not happen. So when you don't give or recognize a legitimate space for the cultural other, for the political other, he is forced to carve his own space.
On December 29, 1930, Iqbal made his famous Allahabad address, in which he became the first to mention the idea of Pakistan as an autonomous region in the subcontinent.
I would like to see the Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh and Balochistan amalgamated into a single state. Self-government within the British Empire or without the British Empire. The formation of a consolidated Northwest Indian Muslim state appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims, at least of Northwest India.
Iqbal truly believed that Islamic thought should be fundamentally, reconfigured, and therefore he talked about the idea of reconstruction. And I quote from his writing where he says, "The task before the modern Muslim is therefore immense. He has to rethink the whole system of Islam without completely breaking with the past."
Iqbal had said many times before his goal was to revolutionize people's minds. His life was spent convincing the Islamic leaders, the ulama, mystic teachers, and Muslim kings that the heart of Islam was compatible with advancements in modern science.
The principle of Islam, he says in one of his lectures, is a principle of movement. And what happens is that we have petrified, so to say, that movement. In other words, the idea that we had some kind of early perfection that could only be destroyed by time is the very idea that he wanted to go against, to consider that instead time is productive.
Eternal principles, when they are understood to exclude possibilities of change, which according to the Quran is one of the greatest signs of God, tend to immobilize what is essentially mobile in its nature.
One of the things that really energized him was the understanding of time, that time is something that is critical to the human being, that we are actually time, that you cannot disown time, you cannot be an enemy of time, and that time in itself brings newness. And therefore he was so fond of this verse of the Quran, "Kulla yawmin huwa fi sha'n." Every day has its own uniqueness, because temporality means change. And therefore Iqbal was actually obsessed with the idea of change. And for him, ijtihad was about this whole momentum of change, the dynamic of change.
In 1931, Iqbal visited Andalusia, Spain, which had once been the home to the Islamic Renaissance. He visited the famous Mosque of Cordoba, which had been converted into a Catholic church in the 15th century. Reminiscent of a glorious age long past, he began to pray in the magnificent structure. Here he was inspired by the power of time.
Day succeeding to night, molder of all time's works. Day succeeding to night, fountain of life and death. Chains of the days and nights, woven by him that is, into his being's robe. What other sense have your nights? What have your days but one blank current of time, empty of sunset or dawn? All art's wonders arise only to vanish once more. All things built on this earth sink, as if built on sand.
In his later life, Iqbal would describe the world as composed through contradictions which hide their inner unity. With difference comes distinction. Day and night, love and reason, mind and body. At the outset, all of these appear pitted against one another. When we look deeper, we see that there is a dialogue taking place.
So you have love, and you have beauty, you have reason, you have the mythological, etc. And they create a magnetic field, and it's within that magnetic field that human existence flourishes, etc. And the polarities are only the kind of two bookends of the story, okay? Because that's what we see. Always we see the ends of it, but really we live in the middle. We live, and we keep on shifting between that. So sometimes one becomes extremely passionate. In another moment, 5 minutes later, I become extremely irrational, okay? Depending on the moment.
We always live in this flux. And you have to get that and be prepared to deal with it. Now, given that you live in flux like that, do you just give up and say, well, you know, what's the use of it? Why build a castle in the sand? You know, it's going to be washed out as soon as the tide comes in. Why do you put all this energy into building this beautiful thing? And then it's all gone. Why you do this? Well, because that's our situation. You know, here we are in this situation where everything's changing, but we have the potential. We can make sand castles. We can do it. We have these powers. So we should use them.
Iqbal was asked to prepare a speech for New Year's Day, which would be broadcast over all India radio. Only a few months before his death, the address would be the poet's final plea for human consciousness to rise to meet its own challenges.
The modern age prides itself on its progress in knowledge and its matchless scientific developments. But in spite of all these developments, the tyranny of imperialism struts abroad, covering its face in the masks of democracy, nationalism, communism, fascism, and heaven knows what else besides. Under these masks, in every corner of the earth, the spirit of freedom and the dignity of man are being trampled underfoot, in a way which not even the darkest period of human history presents a parallel. The rulers whose duty it was to protect and cherish those ideals which go to form a higher humanity have shed the blood of millions in their hunger for dominion and imperial possessions, and reduced millions to servitude simply in order to pander to the greed and avarice of their own particular groups. After subjugating and establishing their dominions over weaker peoples, they have robbed them of their religions, their morals, of their cultural traditions and their literatures. Then they sowed divisions among them, that they should shed one another's blood and go to sleep under the opiate of serfdom, so that the leech of imperialism might go on sucking their blood without interruption. The world's thinkers are stricken dumb. Is this going to be the end of all this progress and evolution of civilization, they ask? That man should destroy one another in mutual hatred and make human habitation impossible on this earth? Only one unity is dependable, and that unity is the brotherhood of man, which is above race, nationality, color, or language. So long as this so-called democracy, this accursed nationalism, and this degraded imperialism are not shattered, so long as men do not demonstrate by their actions that they believe that the whole world is the family of God, so long as distinctions of race, color, and geographical nationalities are not wiped out completely, they will never be able to lead a happy and contented life, and the beautiful ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity will never materialize.
On April 21, 1938, Muhammad Iqbal died in Lahore. Over 20,000 mourners flooded the streets of the city. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs all paid their respects to the man who had become known throughout the subcontinent as one of the most important thinkers and political activists of his time. Written in Persian on his tomb were words appealing to the same universal message he had upheld for his entire life.
We belong to the garden and descend from the same ancestors. Distinctions of color and race are forbidden to us. We are the harvests of a new spring.
He was buried next to Badshahi Mosque in Lahore, where as a young man he had once read his poems to large gatherings. Dirt from his grave was brought to Konya, Turkey, and an honorary tomb was respectfully placed outside of Rumi's own grave. Not even a year after his death, World War II began. With England's promise of independence, communal tension in India grew to a breaking point. By the end of the war, England was nearly bankrupt and was forced to leave India virtually overnight.
This is His Majesty's message. On this historic day, when India takes her place as a free and independent dominion in the British Commonwealth of Nations, I send you all my greetings, heartfelt wishes. Freedom-loving people everywhere will wish to share in your celebration. At this historic moment, let us not forget all that India owes.
With no consensus on the transfer of power and no governing body to maintain order, the chaos Iqbal had hoped India would avoid inevitably consumed it.
And there was no United Nations at this point. There was nobody to look after people. So when the British pulled out and the Muslims are going one way, the Congress Party the other way, the ordinary people are caught up in chaos. And ordinary people, losing their identity and losing their sense of who they are, start killing their neighbors.
The result was one of the largest and most rapid population transfers in history. Over 10 million people left their homes, and amidst the paranoia and confusion, well over 1 million lives were lost. Critics of Iqbal have questioned why he would support the creation of Pakistan when he also spoke of a united India. Others have showered him with praise that eclipse him as a real person. In reality, if Iqbal had been alive to see the partition of 1947, he would have been horrified by the events that took place. Iqbal had said himself that he believed his writing was not going to be received for some time. He sincerely believed he was sending a message to future generations. When we look at Pakistan today, on the surface, it is hard to find good news. In 2009, over 2 million people were displaced from Swat Valley, echoing the horrors of partition over 60 years prior. But in order to understand why these unfortunate events have transpired, we need not look any further than Iqbal's own thoughts. Our lives are only worth living because of love. Love is what acknowledges the other. Hatred, subordination, and fear all betray this possibility of living together in the world. In order to overcome our fears, we must move beyond our oppositional beliefs. Us versus them, religion versus science. Iqbal was trying to help us transcend this way of thinking.
We're living in a world where the attitude, either you're with us or you're against us, has become a core belief. Once this belief has been accepted and embraced, what it does to the individual who has embraced it is that it gives that individual the license, the ethical license, to do to those who are against us things that we would never think of doing to ourselves.
Any institution or belief that negates the same basic rights of others is inherently prone to conflict. If we truly believe humanity can be divided amongst ideological lines, then we have lost touch with the beautiful and humble mystery of our existence. If we cease to accept change, we have robbed ourselves of any growth. we have forgotten who we really are.
We say things that are absolutely, from my point of view, both inaccurate but also stupid. And that is, we will say things like, where are the moderate Muslims? When you ask that question, there's an implication that out of 1.3 billion Muslims, there are not moderate Muslims. Or is Islam capable of reform? You know, and the very people that ask it, I would understand it if they were people who were not only atheists, but atheists who are anti-religious, because then they would ask that about all religions. But instead there's this kind of arrogance, as if all other religious traditions are capable of reform, but maybe Islam isn't.
The conflict within Islam, according to my view, and I think it's Iqbalian thinking the same way, it is a conflict between conventionalism and reformism. But then, of course, there is a large chunk of illiterate people affected by tribalism, regionalism, and things like that, whom you would call popular Islam. So actually there are three-dimensional struggle. The popular Islam, of course, they are not concerned with this conflict of reform, and because they don't get the benefits of reform. Not so far. Neither education, nor health, nor prosperity. Populists, of course, can change. You can transform them through education, through prosperity. They would certainly join the reformists.
The biggest problems facing humanity in our times have very little to do with radical extremists and almost everything to do with our perceptions of ourselves and each other.
What most people slip into is they don't compare their ideal to somebody else's ideal and their realities to somebody else's realities. What human nature tends to do is I'll compare my ideal to your realities.
Colonialism is not really dead in many respects, and there is a colonial form within the process of globalization itself. So globalization has to be rethought, not to just be financial globalization, but truly a way of making the world be one in its plurality. And this force or this trend or this movement towards oneness is really what Iqbal's philosophy is about.
It doesn't make any difference whether the Americans reach the moon. It's the man who is reaching the moon, man who is conquering the planets, man who one day may be achieving further heights.
Beyond all differences, there is the same human goal of building together something that is really humanity fully achieved. All these elements that could seem contradictory at first sight are present in his thinking and have to be reconciled and thought together in some way.
There's some purpose yet to come. You have to attain certain heights, and that can only be possible if you realize what your significance is.
And what we have to do for ourselves as individuals is just first of all know ourselves. That's why if you're speaking to any young person and you say, what is the message of Iqbal? The secret of the self, you have to know who you are.
Iqbal's final poem was titled The Human Being.
To know and see is so easy in the world. Nothing may stay hidden, for this universe is made of light. The nature's veil is translucent if one is willing to see. Far too visible are the angels' faint smiles. This world is an invitation for the human being to look. For every secret is given an instinct to come out of hiding. If I am the end of all, then what lies beyond? Where lies the limit of my unending adventures?
In our changing world, the task set before us is always new. Our quest is manageable only when we can understand who we are before we face the challenges of each new obstacle. Iqbal is a powerful figure for us to recognize today as he reminds us to be critical of all the forces that distract us from the essence of life. He was trying to give us the power not just to confront our destiny, but to create it as we believe it should be.